We'll start with President Trump's job approval ratings. Up 3 points from January to 46%, 52% disapproving in the latest NBC News Wall Street Journal poll. Trump scores best among Republicans with 88% approval, 60% of both rural residents and whites without college degrees, as well as 54% of men and whites. While the president is least popular among African Americans, 88% disapprove, 64% of Latinos disapprove, 61% of women disapprove, while disapproval among young Americans is 57%, 55% among college-educated whites, 51% among independents. This as 41% of voters say they are likely to vote for Trump in 2020, while 48% pick the Democratic candidate. Compared to previous presidents, those numbers are worse than what Barack Obama faced at this point in the 2012 cycle, when he led his hypothetical opponent by 5 points, while Trump is closer to Bill Clinton's numbers in January of 1995, when only 38% said they would re-elect the president. Joe, what'd you think when you first saw these numbers?
I thought of Bill Clinton. Michael Steele, it seemed that the more bad news befell Bill Clinton, the higher his approval ratings went. And by the time he was impeached, and by the time it was evident he'd committed perjury, by the time he'd been stripped of practicing before the bar in Arkansas, and the Supreme Court even stripped him of his rights to practice in front of the bar there for lying under oath. His approval ratings were over 60%. Right. I mean, there were SNL skits about this where Darrell Hammond said, you know what, I can go out into the streets and like smoke pot and whatever, and I'll be just fine, be stoned. Well, Donald Trump faced one of his worst weeks last week. He's had one of his worst months in the past month or so, and his numbers appear to be going up. His reelect still, I mean, you and I have never met a politician who would be excited about a 41% reelect. That means you're going to lose, but still, 46 approval rating. This is about as high as Donald Trump's gotten. Why is it? What's happening?
Well, it's interesting. If I'm Donald Trump, I'm looking at this and I go, I'm not doing that badly. I'm hanging in there. They've thrown a lot at me. I've got investigations, coming from the right and the left. And yet, with the core of his base, and certainly probably elements within the general population, there's something about Trump that's still very appealing. And I think for a lot of those folks behind those numbers is the state of the current economy, where things are for those individuals, their families, their job prospects, their small business, still relatively good. Yes, there's some weaknesses around the edges. There's some concerns about whether or not a recession will kick in by the second or third quarter this year. But right now, in this moment, people feel very, very good. So if I'm Trump, yeah, I go to CSPAC and I give a 2.5-hour speech because I know I can. What it does is it adds another layer of drama and excitement about a presidency that's already have a lot of drama and excitement. So he's in a good spot as he wakes up this morning. And he probably is looking at the numbers and going, what do the Democrats have to offer? What are you going to beat me with? That 41% reelect, yeah, that's a tough number. But to get that extra 5 or 6 points in the next year, I think I can do that.
Well, you could say drama and excitement at the CPAC speech. Obviously, people inside the room thought it was. It was also one of his most unhinged speeches. We'll certainly get to a lot of the things that he said. But again, take a couple of sentences out here, a couple of sentences out there. Mike Barnicle, it would be disqualifying of itself for any politician, for any president, not for Donald Trump. And, you know, this past weekend I was with 6, 7 Republicans. All of them still support Donald Trump. And we were sitting there, you know, they were poking me, laughing. I was poking them. We were just going back and forth. But it's so much like 2016, when I said 2016 was not about Trump, it was about Hillary Clinton. You ask why they support Donald Trump, and they talk about Democrats. They don't talk about Donald Trump. They don't defend him anymore. It's like, I don't want this person to be president. I don't want that person to be president. Those people don't understand me. They're from another world. It's this disconnect that somehow this Manhattan billionaire a supposed billionaire, has figured out how to connect on with people in middle America, and Democrats still aren't.
Yeah, Joe, I don't disagree with that assessment. I think it's fairly accurate, and nor do I disagree with Michael claiming, and legitimately so, that the economy, the state of the economy has a lot to do with those numbers that we just read. There was a blizzard of numbers there. I think, though, there's a little something larger going on, and I think what it is those numbers that we just read at this stage of his presidency, after the 2-hour and 20-minute speech, the rambling speech before the Conservative Political Action Caucuses on Saturday, they prove, I think, that Donald Trump's sustained assault on the nature of the presidency, on our democracy, on common sense, on truth, a sustained daily assault has had a huge impact on the average American voter. They accept things now from the mouth and the behavior of a president of the United States that they would not have accepted from any prior president, nor do I think they would accept it from any of the Democratic candidates running to succeed him.
You know, Mika, as you know, to your consternation, I mean, it bugs you, and it has for some time, that I'm constantly trying to figure out what the other side thinks, whether I'm a Republican and, you know, they're liberal Democrats, whatever. And it's the same thing with Trump supporters, just trying to figure it out. What am I missing? What are my blind spots? And there are a lot of blind spots, whether, you know, I'm trying to figure out what people on the far left are thinking, or what I'm trying to figure out what Trumpists are thinking. But there is no reasoning through some of the hellacious things that were said at CPAC this last week. There is no explaining away some of the inhumane statements that were made at CPAC, some of the inane statements, some of the stupid, just no other word but stupid. But there were a lot of low points there for a conference that I used to go to every year. The worst, of course, was the celebration of John McCain's death. And the fact that the announcement of John McCain's death and the mocking and the attacking of, quote, John McCain's ghost caused the people of CPAC to rise to their feet in a thunderous applause. If you can imagine that these people, who obviously, again, I don't know if they weren't raised right, I don't know if their mothers and fathers never taught them basic values. I'm sure they did. I'm sure they just lost it along the way. Maybe they were just swept up in the excitement of actually being somewhere. I don't know. But when you applaud the death of an American war hero, a man who was imprisoned and beaten so badly that he couldn't even raise his arms over his head for the rest of his life, a man who was allowed to go free early but refused to, said he wasn't going to walk out until his band of brothers walked out with him, who wasn't going to get ahead of anybody else that had been in the Hanoi Hilton. When you applaud the death of that man at CPAC, when actually very little separates you and that man that you were mocking, who recently died, that cancer survivor, who, by the way, whose wife and whose children suffered with him and watched him suffering and battling cancer and slowly dying, to see now that his death was something that Matt Schlapp and CPAC would applaud, something that Matt Schlapp, CPAC, would think was a great thing to be excited about, something that not only Matt Schlapp but also Republicans that spoke at that event, who were John McCain's co-workers in the Senate for years. The fact that Donald Trump has caused this in the Republican Party, that he's caused this in American politics, actually, I think, is probably going to be his worst legacy of many terrible, terrible legacies. But those people that stood up and applauded for John McCain's death, let me just say to you, you may not be bad people, but you sure as hell gave a good impression of what a bad person looks like. And I mean this, and I do mean this with all the love in my heart, understanding that we all make mistakes and all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. I really do hope that this Monday morning, when you wake up, you think about that moment and you feel a little ashamed. You feel a little ashamed and you tell yourself, I've got to do better next time. I can support Donald Trump without being hateful. I can support Donald Trump and still not devalue the worth of human beings that don't look exactly like me, who don't think exactly like me, who don't worship exactly like me. It's not too much to ask. Just think about it. That's all I'm saying. Just think about it this morning.
And yet Republicans are rallying around President Trump. He's firing up his base with that highly partisan appeal, as Mike Barnicle called it, a constant assault. This assault clocked in at over 2 hours. Donald Trump gave the longest speech of his presidency at CPAC on Saturday. There was no vision for America. He just ran through a list of grievances, ranging from coverage of his crowd sizes to
Mickey, he went back to his.
He went back to his crowd size.
It was kind of cute. He was going back to his crowd size at the inauguration for, my gosh, 15 minutes maybe.
Also, his enemies in the media and Special Counsel Robert Mueller's office, rambling a lot and at times using profane language.
This is how I got elected, by being off script. If we don't go off script, our country's in big trouble, folks, because we have to get it back. The Attorney General says, I'm going to recuse myself. And I said, why the hell didn't he tell me that before I put him in? How do you recuse yourself? But the person that appointed Robert Mueller never received a vote. Robert Mueller put 13 of the angriest Democrats in the history of our country on the commission. The Green New Deal, right? Green New Deal. I encourage it. I think it's really something that they should promote. No planes, no energy. When the wind stops blowing, that's the end of your electric. Let's hurry up. Darling? Darling, is the wind blowing today? I'd like to watch television, darling. If you tell a joke, if you're sarcastic, if you're having fun with the audience, if you're in live television with millions of people and 25,000 people in an arena, and if you say something like, Russia, please, if you can, get us Hillary Clinton's emails. Please, Russia, please, please get us the emails, please. So everybody's having a good time. I'm laughing. We're all having fun. And then that fake CNN and others say, he asked Russia to go get the emails. Horrible. I mean, I saw it like 2 weeks ago. I'm watching, and they're talking about one of the points. He asked Russia for the emails. These people are sick. We're waiting for a report by people that weren't elected. Think of this. We had the greatest election. In all fairness, I used to hear Andrew Jackson. This was now greater than the election of Andrew Jackson. People say that. We had the greatest of all time. Now we have people that lost. And unfortunately, you put the wrong people in a couple of positions, and they leave people for a long time that shouldn't be there. And all of a sudden, they're trying to take you out with bullshit, okay? With bullshit.
Well, there's so much to talk about there. First of all, those people that were, quote, trying to take him out are people that he appointed or people that his appointments appointed, whether you're talking about, as he said, Jeff Sessions, a Republican, Christopher Wray, a Republican. I mean, you can go down the long list of people. I mean, they're Republicans. Rod Rosenstein, a Republican. Bob Mueller, a lifelong Republican. You just go down the list. So, of course, that's nonsense. Also, he accuses the media for being sick for something that the media didn't did. We didn't talk about jokes that he told in front of crowds of 25,000. We all have talked about a press conference he had where he looked into the camera without a smile on his face and without any intention of telling a joke, saying, Russia, if you have the emails, send them. And I think the reason, of course, why he's lying about that is he's feeling the pressure because, Mika, of course, that night is when the GRU, Russia's military intel arm, began trying to hack into the DNC. So this is all his people have all said, even his Secretary of Homeland Security, they've all said that Russia's hacking in 2016 and continued hacking is a threat to American democracy. So he can pretend it's a joke and he can pass it off as a joke. And who knows, maybe there will be a couple people that lack knowledge and are ignorant enough to believe that it was just a joke. But of course it wasn't. But Mika, it's so much more than this. This is really nitpicking. People have decided that they're going to support Donald Trump no matter what happens, no matter what evidence comes out. He's got his 40%, 41% saying they're going to vote for him, and nothing will ever change that. As he said during the campaign, he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and people would still vote for him. We now have a cult of personality that would actually allow that to happen. I have no doubt he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, and that 41% who have been swept into this cult of personality would still support him. It's not said in anger. That's not said in despair. That's just a basic logical conclusion based upon everything that we've seen over the past 2.5 years. That's where we are in American politics, and Democrats have to figure out a way to break enough Americans out of a spell to actually get somebody back in the White House that respects Madisonian democracy.
That can win, actually.
That can win.
Which some would argue it's still, we're a long way away from knowing who that person is. Heidi and then Nick, Republicans on Capitol Hill on a number of levels, even as it pertains to what appears to be clear campaign finance violations, continue to defend Donald Trump. What's the word? Is there no sense of the end game here, just the moment?
Mika, I just want to also point out something that in my 20 years of covering Republican campaigns was really poignant to me in that CPAC speech, which is a fixture of Republican campaigns for the past decades has always been Christian values. And this welcome came amid a week in which, if anything else was proven, it was that Michael Cohen showed up with a check proving that the President of the United States had slept with a porn star and had been paying her off while he was in office. And so to me, that was, just another benchmark of how far our politics have moved. But to your question about Republicans, watching the Michael Cohen hearing, it became clear to me, and I think to many others, that while the president's support is broad, you saw no Republican on that committee actually going hard at Michael Cohen, but you also didn't see them defending Donald Trump. And so this is why Democrats believe, it is their calculation, that if they can get the information from the Mueller report actually before the American people, that they may have a chance of breaking that fever, as Joe points out. And that is why, according to our reporting, Mike Memoli reporting today, that the Democrats are going to try and basically use the same arguments that the Republicans used over the past couple of years in terms of unprecedented forcing of information out of the Justice Department that is considered classified and protected, to kind of turn that around now and make that case that this information that Mueller may be imminently reporting has to come before the American people.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.